June 22, 1941. The border between German-occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Dawn breaks across the endless flatlands of the Eastern Front, painting the horizon in shades of copper and ash. The air smells of damp earth and diesel fuel as thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers prepare for Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Among them stands a young Gefreiter named Klaus Reinhardt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his boots laced tight against the morning dew. He is 23 years old. He is trained for this moment. He has been told the Red Army will collapse within weeks, that the Slavic peoples lack the discipline and intelligence to mount a sustained defense, that by autumn he will be home for the harvest. But Klaus Reinhardt does not think about autumn as he steps forward with his unit into Soviet territory. He thinks about the mines. Not the anti-tank mines, which can be spotted by a trained eye and avoided by careful maneuvering. Not the crude explosive devices hastily buried in obvious locations. He thinks about the other mines, the small ones, the ones buried just beneath the surface of the earth, invisible, patient, waiting. The Schützenmine 42, the S-mine. The weapon his instructors called the Devil's Device in whispered tones during training exercises back in Germany. The weapon Allied soldiers would later call the Bouncing Betty. He has never seen one detonate, but he has heard the stories. And as he crosses into Soviet territory on that June morning, his greatest fear is not the enemy soldier with a rifle, or the artillery shell screaming from the sky, or even the Soviet tank rumbling across the steppe. His greatest fear is the 8 inches of steel cylinder buried beneath his next step, waiting to leap into the air and explode at waist height, sending 700 steel ball bearings in a perfect circle of death that can kill or maim every man within a 30-meter radius. Klaus Reinhardt takes another step, and another. The war has begun, but for him, the true terror is not in the battles yet to come. It is in the ground beneath his feet, in the weapon his own nation perfected, the weapon that will haunt both sides of this war until its bitter end. The weapon that turned every field, every road, every path into a potential killing ground where death could rise from the earth itself without warning, without mercy, without distinction between friend and enemy. The S-mine, the cruelest weapon of the Wehrmacht, and the one that would, in time, kill more German soldiers than any tank the Allies ever fielded. To understand why the S-mine inspired such visceral terror, why hardened combat veterans who had faced artillery barrages and machine gun fire would freeze in place at the thought of crossing a suspected minefield, we must first understand what made this weapon uniquely horrific in the context of modern warfare. The development of the Schützenmine began in the 1930s as German military engineers sought to create an anti-personnel mine that could defend larger areas with fewer devices. Traditional mines, buried flush with the ground, had limited killing radiuses and often failed to incapacitate targets even when detonated. The S-mine solved this problem through a mechanism as ingenious as it was brutal. When triggered by pressure or tripwire, a small propellant charge would launch the main cylinder approximately 1 meter into the air, where it would detonate at waist height. The result was a weapon that transformed a single mine into an omnidirectional fragmentation grenade, capable of shredding human bodies across an area roughly the size of a tennis court. The first production models, designated S-Mine 35, were deployed during the Spanish Civil War, where their effectiveness exceeded even the expectations of their designers. Reports from German advisors to Franco's forces noted that Republican soldiers, upon discovering S-mine emplacements, would often refuse to advance, even under threat of execution by their own officers. The psychological effect, military analysts observed, was perhaps more valuable than the physical casualties. A weapon that could make men too terrified to fight was worth a dozen conventional artillery pieces.
But the true horror of the S-mine was not fully realized until the Eastern Front. Because while the weapon had been designed to kill the enemy, it possessed a characteristic that would prove catastrophic for the very army that deployed it. The S-mine was entirely indiscriminate. It could not tell the difference between a Soviet soldier advancing and a German soldier retreating, between an enemy patrol and a friendly supply column, between a Wehrmacht infantryman and the Gefreiter from Bavaria who had helped lay the minefield 3 months earlier. Klaus Reinhardt learned this truth not through his own experience, but through the screams of his comrades. By the winter of 1941, as Operation Barbarossa stalled in the frozen wasteland outside Moscow, the Wehrmacht found itself retreating across the very minefields it had so carefully laid during its summer advance. The irony was not lost on the men. They had planted these weapons to defend against Soviet counterattacks, marking their locations on maps that were supposed to be referenced during any subsequent advance. But in the chaos of retreat, in the blizzards and darkness and desperate confusion of a collapsing front, those maps became useless scraps of paper. Supply trucks took wrong turns and drove into their own minefields. Infantry units fleeing Soviet armor ran blindly across fields they themselves had mined weeks earlier. And the S-mines did not care. They launched and detonated with mechanical precision, killing German soldiers as efficiently as they had killed Soviet ones. A medical officer named Franz Weber, attached to the 6th Army, recorded in his diary in January 1942, "Today we treated 17 men wounded by our own mines. I do not count the dead. There were too many. Some of the soldiers were in tears, not from pain, but from rage. They cursed the mines more bitterly than they cursed the Russians. One man, both legs shredded below the knee, kept repeating, 'We put them there. We did this. We did this to ourselves.' I had no words to comfort him. What could I say? He was right." The psychological dimension of the S-mine extended far beyond its immediate casualties. Unlike a bullet or artillery shell, which came from a visible direction and could be defended against through cover and tactics, the S-mine was an invisible threat that could manifest at any moment in any location. Soldiers on the Eastern Front developed a constant gnawing anxiety that historians would later compare to the shell shock of the First World War. Every step became a potential death sentence. Every patch of disturbed earth became suspect. Sleep was impossible in areas known to be mined because the mind could not rest when the ground itself was an enemy. Soviet soldiers coined a phrase for the sound an S-mine made when triggered: Springer, the jumper. It was a sound that lasted less than a second, a metallic pop as the propellant charge fired. But to those who heard it, that second stretched into an eternity. Because in that brief interval between the launch and the detonation, there was just enough time for a man to understand what was happening, just enough time to realize he was about to die, just enough time to see the cylinder rising from the earth, spinning as it ascended, and to know with absolute certainty that there was nothing he could do to save himself. The Wehrmacht's training manuals instructed soldiers that if they heard the launch sound, they should immediately throw themselves flat on the ground. This advice, while theoretically sound, proved almost impossible to execute in practice. The human instinct upon hearing an unexpected sound is to freeze or to run, not to dive to the earth. And even those soldiers who did manage to react correctly often found that it made little difference. The S-mine's fragmentation pattern was designed to kill prone targets as well as standing ones. Survival was largely a matter of distance and luck.
By 1943, the fear of the S-mine had become so pervasive among Wehrmacht units that German commanders began to notice a disturbing trend. Soldiers were refusing to patrol certain areas, even under direct orders. Courts-martial records from the Eastern Front show dozens of cases where soldiers were executed for cowardice in the face of the enemy, when in reality their crime was refusing to cross suspected minefields. One such soldier, a 20-year-old from Hamburg named Peter Schultz, was shot by firing squad in March 1943 after repeatedly disobeying orders to lead a reconnaissance patrol through a forested area near Kursk. His last words, recorded by a chaplain, were, "I have faced Russian tanks. I have held the line under artillery fire, but I will not walk into a minefield. Shoot me if you must, but I will not take another step." They shot him, and then they ordered the next man forward, and he took the step. And the mine was there, exactly where Peter Schultz had feared it would be. The explosion killed 4 men instantly and wounded 9 others. The reconnaissance patrol was canceled. Peter Schultz, it turned out, had been right, but he was still dead. The cruel mathematics of mine warfare became apparent as the war dragged on. For every mine that killed an enemy soldier, statistics suggested that 2 or 3 would kill or maim a friendly soldier, either during retreat, through faulty map-keeping, or through the simple entropy of long-term deployment. Mines did not expire. They did not become less dangerous over time. A minefield laid in 1941 was just as deadly in 1944, and by then the Wehrmacht had often forgotten it existed. The Eastern Front became a landscape of accumulated death, where the ghosts of old battles lay dormant beneath the soil, waiting to kill men who had not even been conscripted when the mines were first buried. British intelligence officers interrogating captured German soldiers in North Africa noted with surprise that when asked what weapon they feared most, the majority did not mention Allied tanks or aircraft. They mentioned mines, their own mines. One German sergeant captured at El Alamein in 1942 told his interrogators, "Your Shermans do not scare me. I can see them coming. I can hear them. I can fight them. But the Sprenger, it is already there, waiting. It has been waiting since the day we buried it. It will wait forever if necessary, and when it kills me, I will have done it to myself." This was the psychological crux of the S-mine's horror. It transformed soldiers into potential victims of their own defensive measures. The weapon that was supposed to protect German positions became a weapon that killed German soldiers with increasing frequency as the war turned against the Reich. And there was no defense against it. Mine detectors were heavy, slow, and often ineffective against the S-mine's wooden components. Careful probing with bayonets was time-consuming and required soldiers to crawl through potential killing zones. The only reliable method was to have local civilians or prisoners of war walk through suspected areas first, a practice that both sides employed and that constituted a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. Klaus Reinhardt, by the winter of 1943, had personally witnessed 17 men in his unit killed or wounded by S-mines. 3 of those incidents had occurred in minefields laid by their own combat engineers. He had developed a habit that many soldiers shared. He walked exclusively in the footprints of the man ahead of him, reasoning that if that man survived a step, the ground was safe. This provided a small measure of psychological comfort, though logically he knew it was meaningless. Mines could be spaced irregularly. A safe path could end at any moment. But the mind, desperate for any sense of control in an uncontrollable situation, clung to these small rituals.
The symbolism of the S-mine extended beyond its tactical function. It became, in the minds of those who fought against it and those who deployed it, a representation of the fundamental nature of modern industrial warfare. Impersonal, mechanical, unforgiving. The S-mine did not hate. It did not choose. It simply existed in a state of perpetual readiness, a coiled spring of potential death that would trigger with perfect consistency regardless of who activated it.
In this sense, it was the perfect embodiment of a war that had long since transcended individual animosity and become a vast machine of mutual destruction, grinding men into the earth without regard for nationality, ideology, or intent. Soviet soldiers developed their own relationship with the weapon. After capturing large quantities of S-mines during their counteroffensives, Soviet engineers reverse-engineered the design and began producing their own versions, which they used extensively in defensive operations. The weapon that had terrorized the Red Army in 1941 was turned back against its creators by 1944, as the Wehrmacht found itself advancing, or more often retreating, through minefields laid with German-designed mines manufactured in Soviet factories. The irony was bitter, but it was lost on most soldiers, who were too exhausted and too traumatized to appreciate the circular nature of their suffering. A Red Army officer named Alexander Petrov, writing in his journal in the spring of 1944, noted, "We have learned much from the Germans. We have learned their tactics, their organization, their ruthlessness, and we have learned their mines. The lagushka, the frog we call it because it jumps before it explodes. We plant thousands of them now, and I watch the German soldiers cross our fields with the same terror in their eyes that I once felt. There is justice in this, I suppose, but it is a cold justice, because the mine does not care about justice. It only cares about the weight of a footstep." By the final years of the war, as the Wehrmacht retreated across Eastern Europe and back into Germany itself, the accumulation of minefields became a strategic catastrophe. Entire regions were rendered impassable. Roads that had been mined and remined by both sides became death traps that could not be cleared without massive casualties. Civilian populations, returning to their homes after the front lines passed, triggered mines planted years earlier, losing limbs and lives to weapons buried by armies that no longer even existed in their original formations. Klaus Reinhardt survived the war, though he lost his left foot to an S-mine in Poland in January 1945. The mine was German-manufactured, based on the serial number fragments recovered from the site, but whether it had been planted by German engineers or Soviet forces using captured stocks was impossible to determine. In a sense, it did not matter. The mine had been designed in Germany, built in a German factory, shipped east to kill Soviet soldiers, and it had ended up killing, or at least maiming, a German soldier instead. The circle was complete.
In the military hospital where he recovered, Reinhardt spoke with other amputees. Nearly 40% of the men in his ward had lost limbs to mines, and of those, more than half believed the mines had been German in origin. This was never officially confirmed. Record-keeping had collapsed by the final months of the war, but the statistical probability was clear. The Wehrmacht had become one of the primary victims of its own defensive strategy. The cruelest aspect of the S-mine, these men agreed during their long nights in the hospital, was not that it killed. Every weapon killed. The cruelty was in the waiting, in the uncertainty, in the knowledge that every step might be the last, and that the weapon waiting beneath that step might have been placed there by a fellow German soldier, acting under orders, trying to protect his comrades, never imagining that the mine would still be there years later when his own army retreated across it. "It is a weapon that makes the earth itself your enemy," Reinhardt said to a doctor who asked him how he was coping. "And you can never make peace with the earth. You must walk on it. You must sleep on it. You must live on it. And if the earth wants to kill you, there is nothing you can do but take the next step and hope." The S-mine outlived the war that created it. In the decades that followed, as Europe slowly cleared the millions of mines scattered across the continent, the S-mine proved to be one of the most dangerous to defuse. Its mechanism, designed for reliability, meant that mines buried in 1941 were still fully functional in 1951 and 1961 and beyond. Children playing in forests stumbled upon them. Farmers plowing fields detonated them. The weapon continued to kill long after the armies that had planted it had been disbanded, long after the war itself had faded into history. German veterans, in their later years, rarely spoke of the S-mine except to express a kind of grim respect for its effectiveness and a deeper horror at what it represented. In interviews conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, when pressed to identify the most fearsome weapon of the Second World War, many would mention not the Soviet T-34 tank, or the American B-17 bomber, or the British naval blockade, but the S-mine. Because those other weapons, terrible as they were, came from the enemy. The S-mine came from themselves. It was their creation, their strategy, their weapon, and it had turned on them with a vengeance that no enemy device ever matched. One veteran, speaking to a historian in 1983, put it this way: "The Allies did not need to defeat us with their mines. We defeated ourselves with ours. Every field we mined was a field we could never safely cross again. Every defensive position we fortified with S-mines was a position we could never retreat from without casualties. We built a wall of our own weapons, and then we impaled ourselves on it when we tried to fall back. That is the ultimate stupidity of war. We created the instruments of our own destruction and called it strategy."
The legacy of the S-mine extends beyond its specific tactical impact. It represents a fundamental truth about industrial warfare, that the machines and weapons created to project power inevitably consume their creators. The mine that waits in the earth does not distinguish between the hand that planted it and the foot that triggers it. It is the perfect metaphor for the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century, impersonal, efficient, and utterly indifferent to human intention. Klaus Reinhardt died in 1989 at the age of 71. He had lived a quiet life after the war, working as an accountant, never returning to farming. He told his grandchildren very little about his service on the Eastern Front, but he kept, in a drawer in his study, a small fragment of steel, a ball bearing recovered from his shattered foot during surgery. It was rusted and pitted, barely an inch in diameter. To anyone else, it would have been meaningless, but to Reinhardt, it was a reminder that the cruelest weapons are not always the ones that come from the enemy. Sometimes they are the ones that come from the ground beneath your feet, from the plans drawn up in your own war ministry, from the factories in your own homeland. The S-mine was a weapon of terror, yes, but more than that, it was a weapon of irony. It was a device designed to protect, which ended up killing those it was meant to defend. It was a symbol of German engineering excellence, which became a symbol of German suffering. It was, in the end, a perfect encapsulation of the war itself, a machine of death built with precision and care, which destroyed without mercy and without discrimination, until the distinction between victim and perpetrator became meaningless. The S-mine is still there, buried beneath the earth of Eastern Europe. Not literally, most have been cleared, though new discoveries still occur with tragic regularity. But metaphorically, the S-mine remains. It remains in the memories of the soldiers who survived it. It remains in the historical record as evidence of warfare's capacity to consume its own architects. And it remains as a warning that the weapons we create with such confidence, such certainty of their righteousness and necessity, may in time turn upon us. That the earth we mine today may be the earth we must walk tomorrow, and that the cruelest weapon is always the one that makes no distinction between friend and enemy, because in the end, it understands that in war, there is no difference. The S-mine, the bouncing Betty, the jumper, the frog, whatever name it was given, it represented the same truth, that terror is most effective when it is impersonal, mechanical, and patient, when it can wait in the earth for years,
decades, centuries if necessary, until the right foot presses down with the right amount of force, and then it rises, spinning, carrying death in all directions. The weapons soldiers feared more than tanks, because tanks could be seen, heard, fought, but the S-mine was invisible. It was everywhere and nowhere. It was past and future collapsed into a single moment of sudden, catastrophic violence. And for Klaus Reinhardt, lying in his hospital bed in 1945, staring at the bandaged stump where his foot had been, it was the perfect symbol of everything the war had taught him. That you cannot escape the consequences of your own actions, that the defenses you build will become your prison, and that the ground you walk on, if you are not careful, if you are not wise, will rise up and destroy you. The earth remembers what we bury in it, and someday, somehow, it gives it back.